The crack of palm against cheek echoed across Bitter Creek's dusty town square like a gunshot. 14-year-old Serafina May stumbled backward, her hand flying to her burning face as Magnus Cray towered over her with his meaty fist still raised. The girl had refused to open her mouth for inspection, refused to show her teeth like livestock. The crowd of potential buyers shifted uncomfortably in the afternoon heat, but no one moved to intervene. This was business. This was how things worked in 1867 Texas, where work contracts were bought and sold, where freedom was still a luxury many couldn't afford. Magnus grabbed Seraphine's chin with thick fingers. "You'll do as you're told, girl, or the next buyer won't be so gentle." His breath reeked of whiskey and tobacco. The auctioneer cleared his throat nervously, eager to continue the proceedings. That's when the crowd parted. A figure emerged from the back, moving with the slow deliberation of a man who had nothing left to lose. Ezekiel Thornfield hadn't been seen in town for months. His clothes hung loose on his gaunt frame. His beard had grown wild and unkempt, but his eyes burned with something that made the crowd step aside. He walked straight to Magnus Cray, no words, no warning. Zeke's weathered hand shot out and grabbed the settler by his shirt collar, yanking him away from Serafina with surprising strength. Magnus stumbled, his face flushing red with rage and embarrassment. "What in blazes do you think you're doing, Thornfield?" Zeke didn't answer immediately. His gaze swept across the crowd, taking in their shocked faces, their guilty expressions, their careful avoidance of his eyes. These people had known him before the fever took everything, before he became a ghost haunting his own ranch. When he finally spoke, his voice carried across the entire square with quiet authority. "I'm buying her freedom. She's coming home as my daughter." The words hit the crowd like a physical blow. Murmurs rippled through the assembled buyers and onlookers. Some stepped back as if Zeke had declared himself afflicted with plague. Others leaned forward, unable to believe what they'd heard. Serafina stared at him with wide, dark eyes that held too much knowledge for someone so young. Hope flickered there, fragile as candlelight in wind, but fear remained the stronger emotion. She'd heard promises before. The auctioneer fumbled with his papers, clearly unprepared for this turn of events. "Now see here, Mr. Thornfield, this is a legal proceeding. The girl's contract is for 5 years of labor to cover debts and how much?" The simplicity of the question cut through the man's bluster. Zeke reached into his coat and withdrew a leather pouch. The coins inside clinked softly, but the sound carried weight. Sheriff Cornelius Rake pushed through the crowd, his hand resting on his gun belt. A man in his 50s with graying hair and cold eyes, he commanded respect through fear rather than admiration. "Zeke, you need to think about what you're doing here. This ain't some stray dog you're taking in." "I know exactly what I'm doing." But even as he said it, Zeke wondered if that was true. 3 years of isolation had left him hollow, moving through each day like a man walking underwater. He'd come to town only because his cattle were dying and he needed supplies. The last thing he'd expected was to find himself in the middle of a slave auction disguised as debt collection. The fever had taken Margaret first, then little Lucy, 8 years old, with her mother's laugh and her father's stubborn streak. The house had grown so quiet after the funerals that Zeke sometimes caught himself holding his breath, listening for voices that would never come again. He'd stopped going to town, stopped talking to neighbors, stopped caring about anything beyond the basic mechanics of survival. If not for Tobias Wright, the elderly freedman who worked the neighboring land and occasionally brought supplies, Zeke might have disappeared entirely. But something about this moment cut through the fog of his grief. Maybe it was the girl's defiance in the face of brutality. Maybe it was the way the crowd watched with entertainment rather than horror. Or maybe it was simply that Margaret would have expected better from him. The auctioneer named a price. It was steep, nearly everything Zeke had saved from his last cattle sale. He counted out the coins anyway, his movements precise and deliberate. Magnus Cray spat in the dust. "You're making a mistake, Thornfield. That girl's nothing but trouble. Mark my words." Zeke finally looked directly at the man who'd struck Serafina. Magnus was younger, broader, with the kind of casual cruelty that came from never facing consequences. The type of man who saw weakness and attacked it instinctively. "If you touch her again, we'll have a different conversation." The threat was delivered without raised voice or dramatic gesture. Just a simple statement of fact that made Magnus take an involuntary step backward. The money changed hands. Papers were signed. Through it all, Serafina remained silent, watching Zeke with the wariness of a wild animal, unsure whether to run or fight. Father Miguel Santos, the town's priest, approached from the edge of the crowd. A small man with kind eyes and calloused hands. He'd been trying to minister to Zeke's spiritual wounds for 3 years without success. "Ezekiel, perhaps we should discuss." "Nothing to discuss, Father." Zeke turned to Serafina, who stood frozen in the center of the dispersing crowd. Up close, he could see the intelligence in her eyes, the careful way she held herself, the small cuts and bruises that spoke of recent hardships. "You have a name?" "Serafina May." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Well, Serafina May, I've got a wagon over there and a ranch about 5 miles out. You're free to come with me, or you're free to walk away. Choice is yours." She studied his face for a long moment, searching for deception or hidden motives. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because she gave a small nod. As they walked toward his wagon, Zeke became aware of the stares following them. Some curious, some hostile, all filled with the knowledge that something unprecedented had just occurred in Bitter Creek. "Sheriff," Rake's voice carried across the square as he spoke to his deputy. "That man just signed his own death warrant. And maybe hers too." The words weren't meant to be heard, but in the desert air, sound traveled far. Zeke helped Serafina into the wagon seat, his movements careful and respectful. She sat straight-backed, hands folded in her lap, ready to bolt at the first sign of betrayal. The wagon wheels creaked as they rolled out of town, leaving behind a crowd still buzzing with shock and speculation. Neither Zeke nor Serafina spoke during those first few minutes. The silence stretched between them, heavy with questions neither was ready to ask. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. It was the kind of sunset Margaret had loved, the kind that made her stop whatever she was doing just to watch the light change. Zeke glanced at the girl beside him and wondered what he'd gotten himself into. The wagon wheels turned through dust that had seen no rain for months. Each rotation carried them further from the questions in town, deeper into the vast emptiness that Zeke called home. The silence between them stretched taut as fence wire. Serafina kept her hands folded. Her back never touched the wagon seat. Ready to run, even at this distance from town. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. The landscape rolled past in waves of brown grass and scattered mesquite. Wind carved patterns in the dirt that lasted only moments before new gusts erased them completely. Nothing permanent here. Nothing that couldn't be swept away. Zeke's hands worked the reins with the unconscious skill of decades. His eyes stayed fixed on the horizon, but his awareness centered on the girl beside him. She breathed carefully, quietly, the way prey animals breathed when predators were near. "You hungry?" She shook her head. Too quick, too automatic. He reached under the wagon seat and pulled out a cloth bundle, unwrapped it to reveal cornbread and dried meat, set it between them without ceremony. "It's there if you change your mind." The food sat untouched for the first mile. Then her stomach betrayed her with a sound that carried over the wagon's creaking. She glanced at him sideways. Gauging his reaction, Zeke kept his eyes on the road. Her hand moved slowly toward the bread, tore off a small piece, chewed carefully, ready to stop eating if he showed any sign of using the food as leverage. The sun dropped lower. Shadows grew longer. The wagon crested a small rise, and Zeke's ranch spread out below them in the fading light. It wasn't much. A weathered house that had seen better decades. A barn with missing boards. Corrals that held more tumbleweeds than cattle. The place had the look of something slowly surrendering to the desert. Serafina studied it with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned to assess safety and escape routes quickly. The house sat well back from the road, no close neighbors. Isolated enough that screams wouldn't carry, but also isolated enough for privacy, for healing, for starting over if such things were possible. Home, Zeke said. The word came out rusty, as if he hadn't used it in years. An old man emerged from the barn as they approached. Dark skin weathered by sun and wind, white hair cropped close to his skull. He moved with the careful dignity of someone whose body had served him well for 7 decades. Tobias Wright, Zeke said to Serafina, helps me keep this place from falling down completely. Tobias walked to the wagon with measured steps. His eyes took in Seraphine's torn dress, her defensive posture, the way she held herself apart. From Zeke, Miss, he said with a small nod. His voice carried the warmth that Zeke's had lost years ago. She returned the nod. Something in Tobias's manner eased the rigid line of her shoulders slightly. Zeke climbed down from the wagon. Extended a hand to help Serafina, then let it drop when she ignored the gesture. She swung down on her own, landing light as a cat. The house waited, windows dark, door weathered to gray. Zeke stood before it as if it were a challenge rather than shelter. Inside, dust motes danced in the last rays of sunlight. The rooms held the hollow quiet of a place where voices had once echoed, but no longer found reason to rise. A kitchen with a cold stove. A sitting room with chairs positioned for conversations that never came. And down a short hallway, a door. That stayed closed. You can take the spare room, Zeke said. But his eyes went to that closed door, and something flickered across his face. Serafina noticed. She noticed everything. The way his voice caught. The careful avoidance of certain spaces. The dust patterns that showed which parts of the house he used and which he abandoned. This was a man living in a corner of his own life. He led her to a small room at the back of the house. Clean but sparse. A bed with faded quilts. A window that looked out toward distant hills. A wash basin and pitcher. It's not much, it's fine. Her first full sentence since leaving town. Zeke lingered in the doorway, clearly uncomfortable with the domestic arrangements. He'd lived alone so long that another presence felt foreign. There's soap, water in the pitcher, towels clean. She waited until he left before exploring the room properly. Tested the window latch, noted the distance to the ground. Old habits died hard. But as she examined her surroundings, something unexpected happened. The room felt safe. Not just physically secure, but genuinely peaceful. The bed was soft. The quilts smelled of lavender and care. Outside, she could hear Zeke and Tobias talking in low voices near the barn. Their words didn't carry, but the tone did. Concern, planning, the sound of people trying to figure out what came next. Night fell with the sudden completeness of desert darkness. No gradual fade, just day switching to night like a blown candle. Tobias knocked softly on her door. Miss Serafina? I've got some soup warm, if you're interested. She opened the door, to find him holding a steaming bowl. His face was kind but not intrusive. He understood boundaries. Thank you. Mr. Zeke, he's not much for conversation these days, but he's a good man. Lost his family 3 years back. Fever took them both. The information hung in the air. An explanation without being an excuse. His wife was named Margaret. Little girl was Lucy. 8 years old, full of questions and mischief. House hasn't been the same since. Serafina accepted the soup, let the warmth seep through the bowl into her hands. Why are you telling me this? Because you're wondering why a broken-down rancher would do what he did today. And because wondering about people's motives is how you stay alive. She studied his face, found only honesty there. He's not looking to replace them, if that's what you're thinking. But maybe he's looking to honor them. Margaret had strong feelings about what was right and wrong. Later, alone in her room, Serafina sat by the window and looked out at the star-filled sky. The soup warmed her from the inside. The soft bed called to her tired body. But sleep felt dangerous. She'd learned to stay alert, to never fully relax. Safety was an illusion that cruel people used against the vulnerable. But as the night wore on and no threats materialized, exhaustion began to win. Her eyes grew heavy. Her breathing deepened. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions. The people who'd witnessed today's events wouldn't simply forget. There would be consequences, but for now, she had a warm room, a full stomach, a door with a working latch. It was more than she'd had in months. Down the hall, Zeke lay awake in his own bed, staring at the ceiling. The house felt different with another person in it. Less empty, less haunted, but also more complicated. He'd acted on instinct in town, seen cruelty and responded to it. But instinct wouldn't be enough for what came next. Taking care of another person required planning, patience, qualities he'd let wither during his years of isolation. The closed door at the end of the hall seemed to pulse in the darkness. Lucy's room, unchanged since the fever took her. Her clothes still folded in drawers. Her books still stacked beside the bed. Margaret had always said the house was meant for family, for voices and laughter and the controlled chaos of people building a life together. Maybe it was time to stop living in the past. Maybe it was time to see if redemption was possible for a man who'd forgotten how to hope. Morning brought the first sign of trouble pinned to the fence post. Nearest the house, a scrap of paper weighted down with a rock, words scratched in angry pencil. Asterisk, you made your choice. Live with the consequences. Asterisk. Zeke crumpled the note without showing it to Serafina. She was learning to feed the chickens. Under Tobias's patient guidance, her movements still cautious but less rigid than the day before. The morning routine had surprised them, both with its normalcy. Coffee brewed, eggs gathered. Simple tasks that built bridges between strangers. But normalcy was fragile in a place where yesterday's actions echoed through every wind-carried whisper. By noon, the cattle were dying. Zeke found the first one near the water trough, foam around its mouth and eyes rolled back white. The second lay 50 yards away. Then a third. Poison. Deliberate and thorough. Tobias approached with heavy steps, his face grim. Found 3 more by the north fence. The financial blow was devastating. Each dead animal represented money Zeke couldn't afford to lose. But the message was clearer than currency. Serafina watched from the porch as they dragged the carcasses away from the water source. Her hands gripped the railing until her knuckles went white. This is because of me. Zeke looked up from his grim work. Sweat beaded his forehead despite the cool morning air. This is because of them. Don't carry their sins. But guilt was a weight she'd learned to bear young. Every place she'd lived, every family she'd served, trouble had followed. Now it had found this quiet ranch and the man who'd shown her unprecedented kindness. The afternoon brought Father Santos riding up the dusty trail. His horse picked its way carefully around the dead cattle, and his face reflected the gravity of his mission. Ezekiel. Miss Serafina. He dismounted with the careful movements of a man whose body had served him well past 60 years. Father. Zeke's tone held wariness. Visitors meant complications. Iron Jack Murdoch has been asking questions in town about the girl. about what she might know. The name landed between them with the weight of a tombstone. Everyone in 3 counties knew Murdoch's reputation. Cattle rustling was his minor trade. Human trafficking paid better. Seraphine's breath caught. Her hand moved instinctively to the small of her back, where something was hidden beneath her dress. Father Santos noticed the gesture. His weathered hands folded over his saddle horn. "Is there something you need to tell us, child?" The moment stretched taut. Truth balanced. On a knife's edge, waiting for courage or fear to tip the scales. Serafina looked at Zeke. He was cleaning his hands on a rag, the simple gesture somehow reassuring in its ordinariness. A man who dealt with problems practically, without drama or judgment. "I kept records." The words came out barely above a whisper. "What kind of records?" Father Santos leaned forward. She reached under her dress and withdrew a small leather journal, its pages thick with careful writing. The book was worn from hiding, warped from sweat and fear, but intact. Names, places, dates, everyone who bought contracts, everyone who sold them. Her fingers traced the journal's cover. Each page represented risk. Evidence gathered and stolen. Moments when masters thought her too ignorant to understand what she witnessed. Zeke set down his rag. Walked closer with measured steps. "How long have you been keeping this?" 2 years. "Since I learned to write properly." The revelation hung in the desert air. This wasn't just a runaway or a troublesome worker. This was a witness. Someone who could expose the entire network of illegal slavery that operated in the shadows of Reconstruction. Tobias whistled low. "Child, you've been carrying dynamite." "Murdoch must know," Father Santos said. "That's why he wants her back so badly." Serafina opened the journal to a random page. Her handwriting was neat, precise. Names and dates filled the margins, locations marked with careful detail. Marcus Cray bought Jenny and her baby in March, paid extra to separate them. She turned another page. Sheriff Rake took his cut every Tuesday. $20 for each contract he didn't see. The evidence was damning, comprehensive, dangerous enough to get everyone involved killed if it fell into the wrong hands. Why? Zeke's question was simple but carried volumes. Serafina closed the journal, held it against her chest. Because someone needed to remember. Someone needed to witness what was happening. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western hills. Long shadows stretched across the ranch, turning familiar spaces into something more ominous. Father Santos remounted his horse. "You're all in danger now. Murdoch won't stop until he gets that book back." After the priest left, the 3 of them sat on the porch as evening approached. The journal rested on Seraphine's lap, its weight far greater than its size suggested. "We could burn it," Tobias suggested. "Make the problem disappear." "The problem doesn't disappear," Serafina said. "It just continues without witnesses." Zeke studied her face in the fading light. 2 days ago, she'd been a terrified girl at an auction. Now he saw someone older, wiser, carrying burdens that would crush most adults. "What do you want to do?" The question surprised her. People rarely asked what she wanted. They told her what to do, where to go, how to behave. Choice was foreign territory. "I want justice. Justice might get us killed." "Silence definitely will," a coyote called from the distant hills. Its voice carried loneliness and wildness in equal measure. The sound belonged to this place, ancient and unchanged, despite the human drama playing out beneath the stars. That night, Serafina couldn't sleep. Every sound made her tense. Wind through the house became footsteps. Settling wood became opening doors. She rose and walked to the kitchen, where lamplight still flickered. Zeke sat at the table, cleaning, his rifle with methodical precision. "Can't sleep either?" He looked up. His eyes held the weariness of a man who'd carried too much for too long. "Haven't slept well in 3 years." She sat across from him. The journal lay between them on the scarred wooden table. Your wife and daughter. The fever. Margaret first. Then Lucy a week later. Nothing I could do but watch them fade. His hands never stopped moving on the rifle. Clean the barrel, oil the action. Mechanical tasks that soothed frayed nerves. Lucy would have been about your age now. The observation hung in the air. Not an attempt to replace the lost with the found, but an acknowledgement of time's passage and life's strange circularities. I'm not trying to be your daughter. I'm not trying to be your father. They sat in comfortable silence, two broken people finding unexpected shelter in honesty. Outside the wind picked up. It carried the scent of distant rain and the promise of change. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon, building toward something that would wash the air clean or tear everything apart. The choice between courage and safety loomed over them both. Tomorrow would demand decisions that couldn't be undone. But tonight, in the lamplight, they had each other. Two souls choosing to stand together against the darkness. It was more than either had expected to find. The third day brought Serafina to the door that never opened. She'd noticed how Zeke's steps slowed when he passed it, how his eyes avoided the worn wood handle, how the silence from that room pressed against the house. She knocked softly. "Mr. Zeke?" No answer. But she could hear movement inside. The careful shifting of someone handling fragile things. The door opened slowly. Zeke stood framed in afternoon light that streamed through a small window. Behind him, a child's room waited in perfect preservation. Clothes folded in drawers. Books stacked on a knitstand. A rag doll sitting on a pillow. Lucy's room. His voice carried the weight of 3 years' worth of unopened doors. Serafina stepped inside without invitation. The air smelled of lavender and dust, of love maintained and grief preserved. She liked to read. Zeke nodded toward the books. Margaret taught her. Said education was the one thing nobody could steal. Serafina ran her fingers along the book spines. McGuffey's Readers. A Bible with large print. Stories about brave children and distant places. Your wife sounds wise. Wiser than me. He lifted a wooden box from the dresser. Inside, letters tied with faded ribbon. Margaret's handwriting covered the envelopes in careful script. Found these yesterday. Hidden in her sewing basket. His hands shook slightly as he untied the ribbon. The first letter was dated 2 years before the fever. The address belonged to someone in Austin. Serafina watched as he read silently. His face changed. Surprise replaced grief. Understanding dawned where confusion had lived. What is it? He handed her the letter. The words revealed a secret that reframed everything she thought she knew about this quiet ranch. Margaret had been helping escaped slaves. The ranch served as a way station. Food, shelter, directions to the next safe house. All coordinated through a network of churches and abolitionists. She never told me. Serafina read further. Margaret's words described the moral necessity of the work. The sleepless nights when travelers needed shelter. The careful balance between helping others and protecting her family. She was protecting you. And Lucy. More letters revealed the scope of Margaret's operations. Dozens of people had passed through this ranch. Families seeking freedom, children separated from parents, women fleeing brutality. All of it hidden from Zeke, who'd thought his wife's frequent trips to town were social calls. I was blind. You were trusting. Serafina set the letters down carefully. The revelation cast new light on Zeke's actions at the auction. His instinctive response to injustice hadn't been random. It was genetic. Inherited from a woman who died before passing on her deepest convictions. She would have taken you in without hesitation. The words hung between them. An acknowledgement that his rescue of Serafina was less about impulse and more about completing unfinished work. They spent the afternoon reading Margaret's letters together. Her voice emerged from the pages, determined, compassionate, unafraid of consequences when righteousness demanded action. One letter described a young girl, barely older than Lucy, who'd arrived bleeding and terrified. Margaret had nursed her back to health and found her safe passage to Kansas. "I see why you acted like you did," Serafina said. "I'm finally understanding it myself." By evening, they'd reached a decision that felt inevitable. The journal would go to federal authorities. The evidence would be presented. Justice would be pursued regardless of personal cost. Tobias listened to their plan with the gravity it deserved. His weathered hands worked a piece of leather as they talked, muscle memory keeping his fingers busy while his mind processed the implications. "Murdoch won't wait for federal justice. Then we don't give him the choice." Zeke's transformation was complete. The broken widower had become someone Margaret would recognize. Someone willing to risk everything for what was right. That night, Serafina helped him clean out Lucy's room. Not to erase the child's memory, but to honor it by letting the space serve life again. They packed clothes for charity, sorted books for the local school, kept the rag doll and a few treasured items. She would want other children to benefit. Margaret, too. As they worked, Serafina shared pieces of her own story. The families who'd owned her contracts. The small kindnesses that had sustained her spirit. The cruelties that had taught her to document injustice. Why didn't you run? Running doesn't stop the machine. It just finds new victims. Her journal represented more than evidence. It was testimony, witness-bearing. The insistence that suffering wouldn't be invisible or forgotten. They moved her belongings from the spare room to Lucy's room. The transition felt natural rather than forced. A healing rather than a replacement. "This feels right," Zeke said. "It feels like home." The word surprised them both. Home wasn't just shelter. It was belonging, safety, the promise that tomorrow would bring continued welcome. Outside, storm. Clouds built on the horizon. Lightning flickered in the distance. Rain was coming to break the drought that had gripped the land for months. Inside, two people who'd found each other by accident discovered they'd been searching for the same thing all along: purpose, family, the courage to honor the dead by serving the living. Serafina opened her journal and wrote a new entry. Not about injustice this time, but about hope. About a man who'd chosen moral courage over social safety. About a woman whose legacy lived on in unexpected ways. Zeke read over her shoulder. Margaret's influence had reached across death to guide them both toward this moment. "Tomorrow we ride to town. Tomorrow we finish what she started." The storm arrived near midnight. Rain drummed against the roof and windows. Lightning illuminated the landscape in brief, brilliant moments. Thunder rolled across the hills. But inside the house, peace reigned. Two souls had found shelter in shared purpose. The broken places in their hearts were mending through mutual care and common cause. The rain would wash the blood from poisoned ground. Morning would bring new challenges. But they would face them together, armed with truth and sustained by love that transcended biology. Margaret's work would continue. Lucy's memory would inspire justice. And in a small house on a struggling ranch, family was being redefined by choice rather than circumstance. The future stretched before them, uncertain but no longer empty. They had each other. They had purpose. They had the unshakable conviction that some things were worth any risk. It was enough. It was everything. Iron Jack Murdoch arrived with the morning dust, 5 riders flanking him in a line that stretched across the horizon. They moved with the deliberate pace of men who owned time and weren't afraid to spend it. Zeke watched from the porch, rifle cradled in his arms. Serafina stood beside him, her journal pressed against her chest. Tobias emerged from the barn, shotgun broken open across his arm. The riders stopped 50 yards from the house. Close enough to talk, far enough to avoid easy targets. Murdoch was a man built for intimidation. Tall and thick through the shoulders, with eyes that had seen too much cruelty and found it acceptable. His horse stamped impatiently, sensing it. Riders coiled tension. Thornfield, Murdoch. The names carried weight between them. No pretense of civility. I've come for what's mine. Nothing here belongs to you. Murdoch's gaze fixed on Serafina. She met his stare without flinching, though her knuckles went white against the journal's leather cover. That girl's got something that doesn't belong to her. Everything she has, she earned. The standoff. Stretched taut. 5 armed men against 3 defenders. The math was simple. The outcome less certain. You're making this harder than it needs to be, Thornfield. Hand over the girl, and whatever papers she's carrying. We'll call it even. Zeke's thumb found the rifle's hammer. The small click carried clearly in the still air. Counteroffer. You turn around and ride out. We'll pretend this conversation never happened. Murdoch smiled, no warmth in it. Just the bared teeth of a predator. You killed my cattle. Poisoned my water. Threatened my family. That changes the mathematics. Prove it. Don't need to prove what everyone already knows. Sheriff Rake spurred his horse forward from the group. His badge caught the morning sunlight, but authority sat uneasily on his shoulders now. Zeke, be reasonable. This can end peaceful if you just cooperate. Peaceful for who, Cornelius? Rake's face flushed. His involvement in Murdoch's operations was an open secret now, thanks to Seraphine's documentation. I'm trying to help you here. Help yourself. We all know where your loyalties lie. Behind the house, more movement. Riders circling the block. Escape routes. Murdoch had planned this carefully. But planning required knowing your enemy. And Murdoch had underestimated what desperation could accomplish. Father Santos appeared on the road behind Murdoch's men, not alone. A dozen townspeople rode with him. Shopkeepers and farmers who'd found their courage sometime between dawn and confrontation. The balance shifted. Still dangerous, but no longer hopeless. Murdoch noticed the new arrivals. His confidence cracked slightly. This doesn't concern them. Justice concerns everyone, Father Santos called out. The priest rode closer, his small congregation following. Men who'd decided that silence was complicity. Women who'd grown tired of looking away from atrocity. Among them, other freed slaves. People who understood what Seraphine's evidence meant. What her courage could accomplish. Tobias raised his shotgun higher. The motion was casual, almost lazy. But the threat was unmistakable. Lot of witnesses here now, Jack. Murdoch's jaw worked silently. Public confrontations complicated private business. Too many eyes. Too many voices to silence later. This isn't over, Thornfield. Yes, it is. The certainty in Zeke's voice surprised everyone, including himself. But something had crystallized. In this moment, the understanding that some lines couldn't be uncrossed. Serafina stepped forward. Her voice carried across the space between threat and resolution. I have names, dates, every transaction, every payoff, every crime. She held up the journal. Such a small thing to carry such weight. Federal marshals are already on their way. The lie came smoothly, but it felt like truth. Like prophecy. Murdoch's horse danced sideways, responding to its rider's tension. The other men looked to their leader for direction. You're bluffing. Test me. The wind picked up, carrying dust devils across the yard. Everything balanced on knife's edge. One wrong word, one sudden movement. Father Santos urged his horse. Closer to Murdoch. Jack, it's time to go. This is finished. Stay out of this, priest. I am in this. We all are. The townspeople spread out behind him. Not trained fighters, but determined witnesses. Their presence changed everything. Murdoch's men began glancing at each other. 5 against 3 had been acceptable odds. 5 against 20 was suicide. This isn't justice. This is mob rule. This is community, Father Santos replied. Something you wouldn't understand. Serafina walked to the edge of the porch, close enough that her words would carry clearly. I documented everything. Every family separated, every contract sold, every child taken from their mother. Her voice grew stronger with each word. History will remember what happened here. What you did, what we chose to do about it. The journal in her hands represented more than evidence now. It was testimony, legacy, the insistence that suffering wouldn't disappear into forgotten corners. Murdoch stared at her for a long moment. Calculation played across his features. Risk weighed against reward. Finally, he pulled his horse's head. Around. This isn't finished. Yes, Zeke said quietly. It is. The riders retreated slowly, unwilling to show their backs completely. But they left. The immediate threat dissolved into distance and dust. The townspeople remained until the last rider disappeared over the horizon. Only then did shoulders relax. Only then did weapons lower. Father Santos dismounted and approached the porch. Federal marshals really coming? Serafina smiled. The first genuine smile Zeke had seen from her. They are now. That afternoon they rode to town together. The whole group, witnesses and defenders and survivors all. At the church, Serafina read selected passages from her journal aloud. Names were named. Crimes were documented. Truth was spoken in a place where truth mattered. By evening, riders were carrying messages to Austin, to federal authorities who'd been waiting for exactly this kind of evidence. The machinery of justice began to turn, slowly but inevitably. In the church, surrounded by people who'd chosen courage over comfort, Serafina felt something she'd never experienced before. Safety, community, the knowledge that she wasn't alone anymore. Zeke stood beside her, no longer the broken widower who'd stumbled into heroism. He was someone Margaret would recognize, someone Lucy would be proud of. They'd started a reckoning that would ripple far beyond this small town. But tonight, they had each other. They had truth. They had the unshakable conviction that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the cost. The sun set over Bitter Creek, painting the sky in shades of promise and redemption. Tomorrow would bring consequences, but they would face them together, armed with evidence and sustained by community. The storm had passed. Clear skies stretched ahead. Federal Marshal William Hayes arrived 3 days later with a badge that carried the weight of Washington behind it. A lean man with silver hair and eyes that had seen enough corruption to recognize truth when it appeared. Serafina sat across from him in Father Santos's study, her journal open between them. Each page turned revealed another layer of systematic cruelty disguised as commerce. How long did you gather this evidence? 2 years. Sometimes longer between entries when it wasn't safe. Hayes made notes in careful script, names cross-referenced with locations, dates that corresponded with missing persons reports filed in distant counties. You understand what this means? Justice, finally. That afternoon, arrests began. Sheriff Rake was taken from his office in chains. 3 town council members found themselves facing federal charges. The network Serafina had documented stretched further than anyone suspected. Iron Jack Murdoch was found 2 counties over, trying to liquidate assets before fleeing to Mexico. The marshals brought him back in a wagon, his empire reduced to shackles and shame. The trials would take months. But the machinery of justice, once started, proved relentless. By winter, Bitter Creek had changed. New leadership emerged from people who'd found courage in community action. The illegal auctions ended permanently. Serafina stood at the front of the church on a cold December morning, 20 children sitting in makeshift pews before her. Some were freed slaves learning letters for the first time. Others were poor white children whose families had never afforded education. She held up a primer, the same type she'd learned from years ago. Reading opens doors that can never be closed again. The children repeated words after her. Simple phrases that carried enormous weight. Freedom began with literacy. Power grew from knowledge. Zeke watched from the back of the church. Pride filled the hollow spaces where grief had lived for 3 years. Margaret would have loved this scene. Lucy would have been among the students, probably asking too many questions and helping slower learners. After class, he and Serafina walked home together through the winter landscape. The drought had broken completely. Grass grew green between fence posts. New cattle grazed in pastures that had been barren months before. The ranch thrived now, not just as a working operation, but as something Margaret had always envisioned. A way station for people seeking better lives. Families passed through regularly, receiving food, shelter, and directions to opportunities elsewhere. Tobias had built additional cabins to accommodate travelers. The property buzzed with purposeful activity. Children's laughter echoed where silence had once reigned. "She'd be proud of what you've built here," Serafina said. They paused at Margaret's grave. The headstone was simple granite, weathered by wind and rain. Fresh wildflowers lay against. The base replaced weekly by hands that remembered love. "What we've built." This was always meant to be bigger than one person. Beside Margaret's marker, a smaller stone bore Lucy's name. 8 years old forever, but her memory now fed something larger than grief. Serafina knelt and arranged the flowers more carefully. White and yellow blooms that would have made the child smile. "I dream about them sometimes. Margaret and Lucy. They're always together, always happy. What do they say? Nothing. They just watch us work and smile." The sun was setting earlier. Now winter claiming more hours from each day. But the light felt warmer somehow, more purposeful. They walked back to the house where lamplight beckoned. Through windows. Inside, warmth waited, supper cooking. Letters from former travelers who'd found success elsewhere. The kitchen table held correspondence from Austin. Federal authorities requesting Seraphine's testimony in upcoming trials. Her courage would be needed again, in courtrooms where justice required witnesses willing to speak truth regardless of personal cost. "Are you ready for this?" She folded the letters carefully. "I've been ready my whole life." That evening, they sat by the fire and planned for spring. More cabins to build. Expanded gardens to feed increasing numbers of travelers. A proper schoolhouse to replace the church's makeshift classroom. Dreams that had seemed impossible months ago now felt inevitable. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been in town that day," Serafina said. "Someone else would have acted eventually, would they?" Zeke considered the question seriously. How many people had witnessed injustice and chosen silence? How many opportunities for courage had passed unmarked? "I'd like to think so. But I'm glad we didn't have to find out." The fire crackled and settled. Outside, wind moved through bare branches with the promise of spring hidden in winter's grip. They'd become family through choice rather than blood. Father and daughter in all the ways that mattered. Partners in work that honored the dead by serving the living. The journal that had started everything now rested in federal hands. But its legacy lived on in changed laws, reformed communities, and lives transformed by the simple insistence that truth be heard. Margaret's letters had been donated to a historical society in Austin. Her network of safe houses had been formalized into legitimate aid organizations. Her vision of justice lived on in ways she'd never imagined. Lucy's room now served visiting children. Her books were read by young voices that filled the house with laughter. Her toys were played with by hands that had never known such security. The dead were honored through the living. Memory became action. Grief transformed into purpose. Spring came early that year. Green shoots pushed through thawed ground with determination that matched the human spirits they sheltered. New life emerged from soil that had seemed barren beyond hope. Seraphine's school doubled in size. Zeke's ranch welcomed families from across 3 states. The community they'd accidentally started grew into something that would outlast them both. And in quiet moments, when the work was done and the sun painted the western sky in shades of promise, they remembered the moment that changed everything. A slap heard across a town square. A decision made without calculation. A choice that proved one person's courage could ripple outward to transform the world. They'd found each other in the midst of injustice and built something beautiful from the ashes of what was broken. Family defined not by blood, but by shared conviction. Home measured not in acres, but in welcome extended to those who needed shelter. The future stretched before them, uncertain but no longer empty. They had work to do, people to help, justice to serve. It was enough, it was everything. And that is all to the story, for now. Please let me know where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will create a story there. Consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. And if you enjoy our content, click this video on your screen. I promise you, it's worth watching. See you tomorrow.